Hey guys, welcome back. Wave Nunnally here with Bible Unplugged. I'm looking forward to sharing the Word of God with you for an opportunity to study together yet again today. Have you ever wondered how we might be able to know after all these centuries the exact words of Jesus? Have you ever wondered if the writers of the, for example, Gospels got the things right that Jesus actually said? Have you ever wondered how we can know exactly what it was that Jesus prayed, for example, in the Garden of Gethsemane? Well, today we're going to be looking at some material both inside and outside of the Bible and addressing these very things so that as you and I move forward in our relationship with each other and with God, we can move forward in these areas with certainty. I look forward to sharing God's word with you. Let's join together. Today, as we gather together around the scriptures, we're going to be discussing the matters of memorization and oral transmission of authoritative teaching in the area of rabbinic Judaism, within the world of the Pharisaic movement, and how that impacts our understanding of what we have in the New Testament from the lips of Jesus and from the pen of Paul. We're also going to be asking, why would it be that we should even care about these, what seem to be kind of very peripheral issues? I hope that you will enjoy the process of discovery as we process through this information. Join with me. Jesus will talk about the traditions of the elders in Matthew chapter 15. Paul will also write about the traditions of my fathers. What exactly are these people talking about 21 centuries ago? Have you ever also noticed that when Jesus and Paul quote the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, they never seem to struggle for the words. They don't have to paraphrase, nor do they have to pull out a kind of a pocket Gideon scroll of the Hebrew Bible and then read from it. This stuff rolls off of their lips. They get it exactly right every time, and they do it with ease. How is that possible in a world that has no libraries, that has no Bible software, where these men are not walking around with multiple versions of the Bible on their cell phone with the ease of a quick tap to be able to access it? Well, in Jesus' world, he was living in what some scholars have called, my Dr. Father Benzion Wacholder called, a text-bound society. They lived and breathed and moved and had their being in the Bible. And the Bible basically dominated every area of life. It dominated domestic life. It dominated business life. It dominated the world of agriculture. It dominated the world of theological discussion and of court cases. Every area of life was affected by the scriptures. And so these people, Paul and Jesus included, had to know and be conversant in and be able to interact with the Bible. Also, there was a preset educational system in which both obviously participated at one point in their development or another. And we hear about famous rabbis donating funds to set up schools and to decree that other schools had to be set up. The educational system in first century Israel was quite elaborate, quite well developed. Because of that, there was a higher level of literacy in the land of the Bible than there was in other places in the Mediterranean basin in the first century. For that reason, we hear about various aspects of archaeology that inform us that literacy was at quite a high level. We hear, for example, about inscriptions around tombs that warn grave robbers about the curses and dire consequences that are going to come upon them should they enter that tomb and take any of its contents as their own. Well, that simply assumes that the average thief was highly literate and was able to read those inscriptions. Otherwise, they wouldn't be made. We also find out in the countryside, in agricultural areas, we find broken wine jars that have written on them the name, the owner of that particular jar of wine. That assumes that the person who wrote it, that the wine belonged to, was able to write, and that also his fellow workers were literate enough to be able to read it, recognize that it belonged to a certain person, not to another, and to not appropriate that wine for themselves. We also see in coins, regularly used in everyday commerce out in the marketplace, we see Hebrew on one side and we see Greek on another side. The assumption being then that if you couldn't read one language, you could read the other. In fact, the world of Jesus, the Israel that Jesus knew, was bi and maybe even trilingual, able to operate in both of those languages and maybe also in Aramaic, possibly even a little bit of Latin as well. So we're not dealing with knuckle draggers in the 1st century AD. We are dealing with a very highly literate society, people being products of a well-developed school system, a great emphasis on education and literacy. And because of that, we can make other assumptions that, that Jesus and Paul would also make, that people were able to follow along with detailed arguments, lengthy discussions, were able to read and understand written material and the like. We also hear about some 1st century role models that might come as a surprise to some of you. The role model for the 1st century was a person that we have almost demonized, and that would be the Pharisee. Pharisees were not all hypocrites in Jesus' day, and were not, consequently, were also not people who were the boogeyman, the bad guy, always the kind of whipping boy of the story. Rather, these guys were the role models par excellence in the 1st century. And people, because they were lived such exemplary lives and people looked up to them so much, they were understood as being the go-to people for the cues that society would take. For example, in Josephus, a 1st century Jewish historian, we hear about, in his work called Antiquities of the Jews, that the Pharisees had such a great influence on the masses of the common people that whenever they spoke, even when it was against a king or some other high functionary in society, like a high priest, they gained credence among the masses. The masses listened to them and took their cues from these people that are called in Josephus and the rabbis, and as well as in the New Testament, the Pharisees. We also hear from Josephus about the Pharisees, that they adhere devotedly to the good doctrines that have been transmitted. And here the Greek is important, and it's not going to become all that evident until the end of our study. But what I would like for you to do is to take a mental picture of that Greek word, pareidoken, and hang on to that, because at the end of the study, when we're making practical application to the New Testament, to our own lives, this pareidoken is going to become quite important. The Pharisees transmitted pareidoken orally, their prized teachings, and they show great respect to their elders, and they refrain from rashly contradicting what these elders, previous generations of teachers, have taught to them, have handed down or transmitted orally to them. We also hear another passage in the book of Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus' largest work. In book 13, we're told by Josephus that the Pharisees had passed on to the people, to the common people, to the masses, certain regulations handed down, again, pareidoson, by former generations. Take another mental picture, because this word will come in play as we look at New Testament texts as well. they had handed down paredoson by former generations, not recorded in the laws of Moses. So now we're having two separate bodies of authoritative material. There is this stuff that is handed on, transmitted orally, as Josephus says, handed down, and also that which is handed down in written form, that is the law of Moses and other texts in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. Moving forward, does that then mean that we don't have one Torah or one Pentateuch or one law of Moses, or do we have two? We actually have, in the first century, we have two Torahs. Oddly enough, we have the written Torah, what is called by the rabbis Torah shebichtav, and we also have another Torah, Torah sheba'al peh, the second line here on this slide. Torah sheba'al peh, translated, the Torah that is by way of the mouth. In other words, transmitted orally. So two different Torahs, one written and one verbal, one handed down orally, transmitted by word of mouth from teacher to student. We also have the earliest of the teachings of the rabbis that came into written form. It's called the Mishnah. Mishnah in Hebrew comes from a root of three letters, which most words derive from roots of three letters, and that is the SH, all one letter in Hebrew, the N, and then the H at the end, SH, N, and H, Shana. It's kind of like where we get our saying, Rosh Hashanah. It means the head or the beginning of the year. And since years repeat themselves, and this word Shana means to repeat. So Mishnah is learning by repetition, learning by repeating orally over and over until a student has mastered the material that his master has handed down to him. Mishnah. Two Torahs, Torah shebichtav, written Torah, and Torah sheba'al peh, oral Torah, or orally transmitted Torah. And Mishnah, this stuff is memorized by constant repetition. In the Mishnah, we hear more information, get more information about this world of orality, this world of oral transmission, this world of memorization, if you will. Memorization by means of constant repetition. In Mishnah Eduyot, we hear about the great Rabbi Hillel, who was the leader of the Sanhedrin in the generation that saw the birth of Jesus. Hillel says, one hin of drawn water renders a mikveh, a ritual immersion pool, what we would call a baptismal pool, ritually unfit. Now, the people who are talking about this saying of Hillel, this teaching of Hillel, make this comment. We're speaking of using the word hin only because a man must use the manner of speaking of his teacher. What are we meaning by this? Well, evidently, at the time that the Mishnah was written, the word hin, which is a liquid measure, kind of like we would say a gallon or a liter, had passed out of usage. This is somewhere around 100 to 200 years. And so just in the same way that English words pass in and out of the language or stay within the language and change meaning, this word hin, a liquid measure, let's just call it a liter, has fallen out of usage. And yet these later generations are required to quote the earlier authority using exactly the same language that that authority used when originally giving his authoritative teaching. And only then can these later generations update the language, explain what those words mean before moving on into more material. The next text in Avot chapter 3. He who forgets one word of his study, this constant repetition, learning by repetition, he who forgets one word of his study, the scripture reckons it to him as though he was guilty against his own soul. basically meaning he had committed practically the unpardonable sin. Mishnah Avot, chapter 6. Greater than priesthood or kingship is the one who retells exactly what he has heard and reports a thing in the name of the one who said it. Notice that Hillel was cited earlier as a source for an authoritative teaching going back several generations. Here we're told that the person is to be extolled and to be held in high honor, even above a priest or above even a king, if he's able to quote exactly what he learned from former generations, from his master, learned from this material that is handed down orally and then memorized by constant repetition. He who retells exactly what he has heard, not paraphrase, not update, but rather using the exact language of the teacher, is retelling exactly what he had heard, almost like an audio tape, almost like a videotape, reproducing exactly what has been heard. Here another, and reports the thing in the name of the one who said it. In other words, does not get his authorities confused. Doesn't confuse a saying of, for example, Shammai with something that was said by Hillel. And so you've got to not only keep the wording straight, you've also got to keep the source straight as well. Mishnah Avot, chapter 6 again. He who tells a thing in the name of he who said it brings deliverance to the world. You're actually performing practically what constitutes an act of redemption if you're able to accurately remember and accurately transmit in the name of the person who gave that ruling or gave that authoritative teaching. Consider another one in the Babylonian Talmud Bavli, the TB there at the in the middle of the slide. Sanhedrin, page 99b. Rabbi Akiva says, sing it every day. And the gloss or the interpretation of what this early sage said is, in other words, you should review your studies like a song that a person sings over and over and over. In other words, constant review and constant study. This is the way that authoritative religious teaching was transmitted in the 1st century AD. This is what the evidence of texts like the material from Josephus and this material from the early rabbis is telling us, is clarifying for us. In modern Israel today, as well as in Jewish communities all over the world, there are institutions called yeshivot. A yeshiva is a place where you sit and study. You may have seen this in movies like Yentl or Fiddler on the Roof, where the Jewish community comes together, men, and they sit and study and they debate and they review and they memorize these texts, gigantic volumes of text, until they have it down word for word, are able to repeat it at will, upon demand, word for word. In Israel today, there is a movement called the Datiim, the ultra-Orthodox, those who wear the black clothing and the large hats and the like. And these guys will go to these yeshivot, to their own yeshiva. They will sit and they will study, they will read, they will review, they will quote, they will memorize, they will quiz one another, they will debate with one another, quoting authority after authority until an issue to their satisfaction has been resolved. I went to school with these kinds of people as my professors. When I got to Hebrew Union College in 1986, I was studying with people like Werner Weinberg, who was a Jew from Germany, was able to escape the Holocaust, with Yitzhak Yerushalmi, who was a Jewish professor of mine from Turkey, who was fluent in about 6 or 8 or 9 languages. He did his PhD at the Sorbonne in French in France, but he did his PhD in Arabic. He had these guys, Eugene Mahali, my Midrash professor, memorized tons and tons of these ancient, traditional, authoritative rabbinic texts and had them at their disposal. I sat in the back of the room near these guys so I could hear them talking to one another when a visiting lecturer would come from Yale or Harvard, somewhere like that. And you could hear these guys from the old world who had memorized this stuff as children, had learned this stuff from an early age. And when the lecturer would make a point or make a statement that they disagreed with, you could hear them mumbling those texts, repeating those texts under their breath, sometimes comparing texts, sharing text with one another, but always orally, always constantly quoting from memory. My doctor father, as I mentioned earlier, was Dr. Benzion Wacholder. He was in the top 10 or 20 authorities in the Dead Sea Scrolls in the entire world, and just an amazing man. He lost his entire family in the Blitzkrieg when the Gestapo reached Warsaw, Poland, where his family lived. The only reason that he survived was that he had spent the night with some friends out in the country. And he taught me and coached me through the remaining part of my doctoral work and through all of my doctoral dissertation on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, Dr. Wacholder it taught me a number of really important things. One thing that he said was, Wave, if you ever want to understand the words of Jesus, you have to understand him as a first century, a Second Temple period sage. You have to read the writings of the New Testament, he would say, like you would read an intertestamental, a between the testaments document from sectarian Judaism. Another thing that he told me in answer to a question one time, I said, Dr. Wacholder, when you were a kid growing up and you were dropped off and you began memorizing all of these materials, volumes and volumes of materials, and memorizing them, knowing them by heart, having them at easy access at a moment's notice, quote, just at a will. Were you looked at as being some kind of like a Bible nerd, or as being a geek, or as some, bizarre aberration of society? And he said, oh, no, Wade. He said, if you couldn't memorize this stuff, you were looked at as being mentally challenged. I went, okay, sign me up, because, that's kind of where I live and move and have my being. But Dr. Wacholder was Dr. Weinberg, Dr. Yerushalmi, Dr. Mahali. These guys were from a world that almost doesn't exist anymore. Only in certain pockets and places. I mentioned the Datiim in Israel, and in certain places in the United States, like LA and Chicago, New York and Philadelphia. There are only pockets of these people still left. And yet these guys in the 20th and 21st centuries were preserving a form of knowledge, an ability to memorize, like the brain was a finely honed muscle that is almost unknown. With our Post-it notes and with our cell phone reminders going off constantly, we are moving further and further away from this world. And yet this is the very world that was being described by Josephus, a first century Jewish historian, that said that all of this vast material, this oral Torah, this Torah Sheba'al Peh, was being passed on by word of mouth, by an authoritative teacher proclaiming it, and then disciples memorizing, studying, repeating until the material was learned by heart. And so this is exactly what we're hearing about, this Torah Sheba'al Peh, this, not the written Torah, but the oral Torah of the rabbis, of the early Pharisaic movement. that Jesus was referring to in Matthew 15 when he called it the traditions of the elders. This is exactly what Paul was talking about. And by the way, we hear in the book of Acts, chapter 26, that Paul grew up at the feet of Gamaliel. And who was Gamaliel? The leader of the Pharisaic party and the most influential Jew alive in the first century. So Paul was trained by the best. He was trained, he had a Harvard pedigree in his educational background. And he says that he was learning the traditions of his fathers, exactly what Josephus is talking about, exactly what the Mishnah and other rabbinic texts are talking about. This is the oral Torah. This is the reason why Jesus then and Paul are able to, with that finely tuned, finely honed muscle, their brain, memorize tons of stuff, including the Hebrew Bible, what we call in the West the Old Testament. In 1 Corinthians, further, we hear from Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Now I praise you because you remember everything that I taught you, and you're holding firmly to the traditions. There it is, the paradosis. And that's that word that we listened to, that we heard, that we read, that mental picture that you took back when we were doing those texts from Josephus. The paradosis, just as I delivered them to you. Now, this is not paradise. This is paradosis. This is the traditions. These are those authoritative, orally transmitted materials that Paul had handed down to the Corinthians when he was with them in Corinth. Notice this is 1 Corinthians. Paul hasn't written to them before, so they don't have this stuff in written form, not until now, not until what we're reading in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. He's praising them because they've held on to the materials that he handed down to them in person, verbally, and that they remembered and are now holding fast to and are living their lives in accordance with this, if you want to call it, oral Torah, this Torah Sheba'al Peh, this Torah transmitted by means of the mouth and by memorization. We hear about the same thing in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, where Paul says, so then, brethren, stand firm and hold to the traditions. This is again, this paradosis, that again, these orally transmitted traditions, which you were taught, whether by, listen to this, word of mouth or by letter from us. So we're right at that tipping point in the middle of the first century AD, where we're beginning to get the first written material coming to us in terms of things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, in terms of this material that Paul is producing here by letter from us, and also eventually another 100 years or so into the future, where we're beginning to get this material written down in rabbinic circles or Pharisaic circles. Paul will say that in Galatians chapter 1, I did not receive this authoritative religious material that I'm sharing with you. I didn't receive it from man, but I received it through a revelation. So Paul is getting this language of receiving this material. And again, it's not in written form. That's not what we hear about in terms of his experience with the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus. But rather, this is stuff that he learned, that he heard with his ears, that was spoken from someone's mouth. Remember the phrase, Torah Sheba'al Peh, the Torah that is of or from the mouth, by means of the mouth. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 2, hold firmly to the traditions, that paradosis, just as I delivered and handed those down to you. It's the same language that we heard about in Josephus. It's the same kind of language that is assumed by texts like we heard from in the Mishnah. In 2 Thessalonians, Paul will continue, I want you to keep aloof from every brother that leads an unruly life, and not according to the paradosin. It's a derived form of the same word, that paradosis, paradosin, that paradosin that you received from us. These traditions that are handed down by word of mouth, that are heard by the ear, that are repeated and then memorized, to the repeated until memorization takes place, until this is a permanently lodged in our long-term memory, which you received from us. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Listen to the language very carefully. This is going to be important. For I received from the Lord what I also delivered. That's paredoka, what I also delivered. This is that authoritative oral material that's being handed down. We heard it from Josephus about the Pharisees. We're hearing it now in our New Testament from Paul, talking about the revelation that he received from God orally, not in written form. Bible doesn't fall out of heaven on golden plates. And yet we, in certain circles in Christian circles, you almost get that idea, that attitude that is indeed the way that we receive the New Testament. But what we're hearing now is about the very nuts and bolts of the way that we got this part of our Bible. I received from the Lord what I also delivered, oral transmission, memory by repetition, what I delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, in the night in which he was betrayed, took bread. And then Paul goes on to give that well-known passage that is often read directly before communion or during communion. The Lord, in the night he was betrayed, took bread, he blessed it, broke it, and said, all of you eat from it. In 1 Corinthians, we hear the same kind of language. The verbs are reversed, but the same kind of language. 1 Corinthians 15, I delivered paredoka. It's again that paradosin, that paradosis that we hear about from Josephus about the Pharisees, about their oral teaching, those things not written down in the law of Moses. I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, delivering and received. I received this stuff and I delivered it. I handed it down. I passed it on to you in verbal form, in oral form, and then memorized by repetition. I delivered to you what I, of first importance, what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures. We've done study on that verse alone. But the focus of our current study is on this, the passing on of authoritative religious material, authoritative to determine how you live your life and what you believe about God and about everything else that he created. I delivered and I received. Remember again these passages from Josephus, 1 Antiquities 18. The Pharisees adhere devotedly to the good doctrines that have been transmitted, again, paredoken, paradosis, the orally transmitted authoritative religious material, transmitted orally to them. Another text from Josephus that we already covered, the Pharisees passed on to the people certain regulations handed down, paredosan. All these words are simply derivations of the same thing. They vary only in terms of number, like singular versus plural, present tense versus past tense, but it's the same word, paredosan, handed down, passed down, delivered, transmitted orally, which they have handed down from former generations and not recorded in the laws of Moses. Those two different Torahs or Torot, Torah sheba'al peh, Torah shebichtav, Torah that is handed down by means of, through the agency of the mouth or orally, and Torah that is written down, what we have in the first 5 books of the Bible. In Mishnah Avot, to return to the teachings of the rabbis, we hear about the history of this oral transmission in a beautiful text, this first chapter of Tractate Avot. Moses received the Torah from Sinai and delivered or handed down or passed it on, Masar, passed it down to Joshua. Joshua received it from Moses and handed it down to the elders. The elders received it from Joshua and handed it on to the prophets. The prophets received it from the elders and handed it down to the men of the great synagogue. You get this received and delivered kind of language. That, my friends, is exactly what we were hearing from Paul. I received from the Lord what I delivered to you. I praise you because you received what I delivered to you and have maintained the traditions in their integrity. The stuff that we're hearing about, the very language, the verbs that we're hearing are the same verbs that we get in the New Testament that we get in Josephus. What we're seeing now is that the rabbis are telling about their own story, their own history, the history of this handed down, transmitted by mouth, memorized by constant repetition, is this Torah Sheba'al Peh that comes from Moses on Sinai down through the generations until finally Shammai and Hillel pass that on to the people of Jesus' generation. The language is the same. It's a really neat thing that we have Josephus, because Josephus is telling us exactly what this Mishnah text is telling us. The Mishnah was written in Hebrew, though, and the New Testament was written in Greek. So how can we say that, yeah, what Jesus is talking about and what Paul is talking about, well, even though we can't prove it because of the language difference, Hebrew in the rabbinic text of the Mishnah and Greek in these texts that we get from the New Testament, thank goodness we have Josephus. Our friend Josephus, over the 21 centuries, he has preserved for us the fact that this paradosis, this authoritative oral material, is exactly what the Pharisees were transmitting orally. And this is exactly what we're getting in this Mishnah text. All of the stars align. All of these texts connect. Whether it's this Mishnah text, it's the Josephus text that we studied before, tracking right on into the New Testament text that we looked at. Basically, we have in Christianity, in early first century, first generation followers of Jesus, these people are maintaining the same practice of training disciples by oral transmission. And those disciples then become responsible for remembering accurately what is being taught to them by these authoritative people that we call apostles. And then they're supposed to conduct their everyday lives based on that authoritative oral teaching. So this is what was going on in the time period between the events of Jesus' life and when they were written down by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Whether that time period, that delay in writing, was 10 or 20 years, as suggested by many conservative scholars, or whether it was 20, 30, 40 years, as suggested by more moderate to liberal New Testament scholars. There was indeed an oral stage, called that exactly by all New Testament scholars. And now we can recognize, yeah, there's a legitimacy to that, because that's exactly where culture was. That's exactly where the religious community was developmentally in the first century. Rabbinic material wouldn't begin to be written down until around the year AD 200. The only antecedent, the only predecessor of the New Testament in writing down this oral stuff happens to be the Dead Sea Scrolls. So at the time of the New Testament, these people following the conventions set down by the rabbinic, if you will, Pharisaic community. Jesus and Paul are both rabbis, functioning as rabbis. These guys in the New Testament community, first century, first generation followers of Jesus, are doing the same thing that had been done in the land of Israel for 200 plus years prior to their arrival on the scene. They learn by listening, and they memorize by repetition, and then they recite to the next generation of disciples. Those disciples then simply repeat the process. They learn by listening, and then they recite, they repeat until they memorize. The teachings of Jesus, we can be assured that we have an accurate representation in our written gospels because of this kind of oral transmission, this kind of educational system, this kind of emphasis on memorization. The prayers of Jesus, whether it's in the Garden of Gethsemane or John chapter 17 and the like, we can be assured that we have the very prayers of Jesus. Why is that? Well, it's not because they had tape recorders. It's not because they had some sort of button that they could enable their phone to function as a tape recorder. It was because of that developed accuracy of the memory. It was relied upon. It was trusted in this community in the same way that it was still functioning in my lifetime, and that I was hearing my own teachers engage in during my doctoral studies and when I lived in Israel as well. The teachings and the prayers of Jesus, we can trust that we have accurately preserved records in our written gospels, because it's based on an accuracy of memory that tracks all the way back into pre-Christian Judaism. The trustworthiness of the rest of the New Testament, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus himself being the chief cornerstone. We can trust the rest of the New Testament record. Why is that? Because it all derives from that first century Jewish mentality in the land of Israel. Thank God that the revelation, the apex of God's revelation activity to human beings, that is, that Jesus becoming flesh, that happened in the land of Israel and in the first century, and in the context of what we call rabbinic or Pharisaic Judaism. If it had not, if it had occurred in the Renaissance, if this event of redemptive history called the Incarnation had happened sometime in the Stone Age, or had happened maybe in the 20th century, the likelihood that what Jesus said, what he taught, and what he prayed being memorized and accurately transmitted until it could finally be reduced to writing, quite unlikely. But we can give thanks that God, in his sovereignty, in his mercy toward us, in his desire to preserve accurately his word, the word became flesh and dwelt among us in the very context of land of Israel, first century, the role models of society being the rabbis, who were the intelligentsia or leadership of the Pharisaic movement. And because of that, we can trust our New Testament to be an accurate representation, to have accurately preserved the realities that took place in the first century that are still the foundations of our faith. You know, this kind of study that we're engaged in, I recognize that it's not what you typically get on Christian TV. It's not even what you normally get on YouTube. But this is what God has put on our hearts. This is the training that he has given us the opportunity to be impacted by, those great luminaries that I mentioned earlier. Thank God for them. Thank God for the opportunity to live and study in the land of Israel. This is the kind of stuff that we bring to the table. Other people are gifted in other ways. and thank God for them and for their ministries. But this is what God has uniquely called us to do at Bible Unplugged. We don't deal with things in a surface manner. It's not just constant practical application like 6 ways to raise successful kids for God or 6 steps to power with God in prayer. Okay, it does exact a little bit more of a price from us. It's a little bit deeper dive. It requires that we focus our what mental acuity that we do have on a certain set of texts each time that we come together to study for this. But this is what we do, and this is who we are. Thank you for joining us again. Thanks for another opportunity gathering around God's word to feast on its richness. And I trust that this deep dive that we've engaged in and the tools that we bring and the material, the evidence that we bring will have blessed you and built you up in your most holy faith and will enable you to go forward with an assurance that the texts that your faith is based on are grounded and rooted solidly within a cultural, historical reality that is then guaranteed by the evidence that we presented today to have been accurately preserved by the accuracy of first century Jewish, land of Israel, rabbinic memory. God bless you richly. Go forth and serve him in joy and in assurance as you represent him in your world in the coming days and weeks.